We're going to seal up our borders. We want people to come in, but they have to come in legally.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to get past the headlines and really understand how U.S. legal immigration works?
Definitely. It's such a complex topic.
It is. So we're going to go deep today. We're diving into research from the Migration Policy Institute.
Oh, they're a great source. Very well-respected, nonpartisan think tank focused on migration.
Exactly. So we can get a clear picture,
Yeah.
unbiased. And just for kicks, we even dug up a quote from, well, let's just say someone who's had some strong opinions about immigration.
Oh, I think I know who you're talking about.
He said, we're going to seal up our borders. We want people to come in, but they have to come in legally. And he guesses.
Maybe someone who liked to build walls.
You got it. But our mission today isn't about politics. It's about facts. We're breaking down the legal ways to immigrate to the U.S., how many people actually do it, and some surprising things that might change how you think about it all.
Sounds good to me. So where do we start?
Well, the U.S. system basically boils down to two main paths, right?
Yeah, you've got your permanent visas or green cards, as most people know them, and then temporary visas, also called non-immigrant visas.
So it's kind of like deciding if you want to rent or buy a place.
That's a great analogy. A green card is like owning you're here to stay, but a temporary visa is more like renting for a set amount of time.
Okay, I like that. But what if you're renting and decide you want to buy? Can you switch from a temporary visa to a green card?
You can, but it's not always easy. There are certain conditions and qualifications you'd have to meet. But, one thing that often surprises people is just how many green cards the U.S. actually grants each year.
Really? How many are we talking? I honestly have no idea.
About 1 million?
Wait, 1 million? Seriously? Every year?
Every year.
Wow, that's way more than I thought. I guess with all the talk about limiting immigration, I just figured it was a much smaller number.
It's a big system.
Yeah.
So are you curious who all these people getting green cards are?
Absolutely. What's the main reason? What'd you say?
Well, family ties are a major factor. Family reunification is actually a core part of U.S. immigration policy, believe it or not.
So if you want a green card, having a relative who's a U.S. citizen is kind of the golden ticket then.
It can definitely help, but it's not quite that straightforward. It's not just about having any relative. There are different categories within family-based immigration.
Oh, so there are like levels of family.
In a way, yes. You've got immediate family members, spouses, parents of U.S. citizens, unmarried children under 21. They have a special status with no annual limit on visas.
So those folks are basically guaranteed a green card if they apply.
Pretty much. But then there are preference categories for things like sponsoring siblings or adult children, and those do have limits.
Ah, okay. So even if you've got family here, there's still only so many spots each year.
Exactly. Which means...
Wait lists.
You got it. And those wait lists, depending on what category you're in and what country you're from, they can get pretty long.
Long, like how long are we talking here? Months?
Try years, sometimes even longer.
Years. Wow. Okay, that's much longer than I pictured. Like what would be an example of that?
So let's say you're a U.S. citizen and you want to sponsor your adult child for a green card. For most of the world, you're looking at a wait time of over 7 years. But for someone from Mexico, over 21 years.
21 years? Are you serious? That's longer than some people are even adults.
It is a long time. So yeah, having family in the U.S. can be a huge help, but it's definitely not a guarantee of a quick or easy process.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so family is a big part of it, but it's clearly not the whole story. What about all this talk about needing skilled workers? Where does that fit in?
That brings us to the other major path to a green card. Employment-based immigration.
Ah, okay. So like doctors, engineers, scientists, that sort of thing.
Exactly. The U.S. has this whole system of preferences for employment-based green cards. 5 different categories, actually.
So I'm guessing those are for the workers everyone's always saying we need more of to stay competitive and all that.
You got it. But there's only a set number of these green cards available each year.
How many?
140,000 for all 5 categories combined.
140,000.
Huh.
Honestly, that seems kind of low, doesn't it? Compared to the family-based numbers.
Well, there's a catch. That 140,000 includes not just the workers themselves, but also their spouses and children. They all count towards the cap.
Oh, wow. So the actual number of green cards going to those highly skilled workers is way less than 140,000 then.
Quite a bit less, yeah. It can be a bit misleading if you just look at the total number.
Definitely. And I'm guessing within that 140,000, a big chunk goes to those H-1B visas. That's the one you always hear about in the news.
You're right. The H-1B gets a lot of attention. It's specifically for what they call specialty occupations, those really highly skilled positions like software engineers, data scientists, the jobs that need a ton of specialized knowledge.
Got it. So to even qualify for one of these visas, you've got to be at the top of your game.
For sure. You usually need at least a bachelor's degree or the equivalent in the field, and your employer has to show they couldn't find a qualified American to do the job. There's a whole process.
Makes sense. But there's still only so many H-1Bs to go around, right? Isn't there like a lottery or something?
Yep, 85,000 per year, and it's a lottery system. So it's incredibly competitive, and it can be really tough to get one. Plus, there's a lot of debate about whether the H-1B is actually being used fairly.
Yeah, you hear stories about companies using it to replace American workers with people who work for less.
Yeah, exactly. It's a complicated issue. But so far, we've talked about family and employment. But what about those stories you hear about winning the lottery for a green card? Or seeking asylum? Do those work differently?
Oh, that's right. Good point. Those always seem kind of mysterious to me.
Yeah, those are examples of paths that go beyond the two big categories we've been talking about.
So like side roads to the same destination.
You could say that. The diversity visa lottery or the green card lottery, as most people know, that's totally random.
It's like actually winning the lottery with a green card as the prize.
Pretty much. It's for people from countries that haven't historically sent a lot of immigrants to the U.S. It's meant to, well, diversify the mix, basically.
Okay, that makes sense. And 50,000 visas are up for grabs. What are the chances of actually winning that thing?
Millions apply each year, so not great, to be honest. But it's an option for people who don't have family ties or a job lined up here in the U.S. and who meet the other requirements.
Right. A shot in the dark, but a shot nonetheless. And then there's a whole asylum thing. That one always sounds so intense.
It is. That's the humanitarian route for refugees and asylees, people who need protection because they're being persecuted back home.
So both involve needing safety, but what's the actual difference between a refugee and an asylee?
The main difference is where they apply. Refugees are vetted and approved before they ever set foot in the U.S., often by the UN Refugee Agency. Asylees apply for protection once they're already here in the U.S. It doesn't matter if they came legally or not.
Ah, okay. So it's about whether you're already in the U.S. or coming from outside. Either way, though, it sounds like a really tough process.
It can be. It's very rigorous, takes a long time, lots of scrutiny, but it offers a way for people fleeing really bad situations to find safety here.
Definitely. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about green cards, which are like the key to the kingdom, right? Permanent resident status.
Yeah.
But what about all those temporary work visas you always hear about? The ones that aren't necessarily about staying here forever.
Those add a whole other layer of complexity. It's not just about wanting to live here permanently, it's also about the temporary needs of the U.S. workforce.
So like filling gaps where there aren't enough Americans to do certain jobs.
Exactly. And there's a whole bunch of categories for those temporary work visas. You've got the H-2A for agricultural workers, H-2B for seasonal and non-agricultural work, L visas for company transfers, O visas for people with extraordinary abilities. It's a long list.
Wow. So even with all this talk about wanting to limit immigration, there are still very specific ways for certain workers to come here, huh? It's not just a blanket no.
Right. It's way more nuanced than people often realize.
It is. And it's easy to miss all those details when you just focus on the big picture. Like you mentioned the TN visa earlier, right? The one that came from NAFTA.
Yep, that one's specifically for professionals coming from Canada or Mexico. Just highlights how even with all the debate about immigration, there's an understanding that the U.S. economy needs certain workers too.
It's all about balance, I guess.
Yeah.
Speaking of the big picture, I'm curious, do certain countries kind of dominate when it comes to who gets green cards? Are there trends?
You do tend to see certain countries at the top of the list: Mexico, China, Cuba, India, the Dominican Republic, and the Philippines.
Interesting. So it's not just about what kind of visa you apply for, but also where you're coming from.
Absolutely. And that actually ties into something called the per country cap. Basically, there's a limit on how many people from a single country can get a family or employment-based green card each year.
Oh, why is that?
It's meant to keep things diverse, so no single country has too much sway over the flow of immigrants. It's capped at 7% of the total.
7%, huh? Okay, I can see the logic there. Spread the love, so to speak. But I bet that, combined with those long wait times we talked about earlier, doesn't that make things even tougher for people from countries with a lot of people applying?
You got it. That per-country cap can really exacerbate the backlog, especially for family-sponsored visas.
So even if you have a family member here who can sponsor you, you could still be waiting decades for a green card just because of where you're from.
It happens, unfortunately. It's a complex system with a lot of moving parts.
It really is. And speaking of complex systems, remember that quote we started with about sealing up our borders. How does all this we've been talking about, with all its different pathways and rules, how does that fit with the stuff you hear politicians saying about immigration all the time?
That's such a great question, and it gets to the heart of why understanding legal immigration is so important. What we've been talking about, these legal PABs, these are separate from border security and undocumented immigration. Those are different issues, and they often get lumped together in political rhetoric, but they're not the same thing.
So it's like people using the same word, immigration, but talking about totally different things. No wonder everyone's confused.
Exactly. So as you listen to those debates and the news coverage, it's crucial to think critically. Are they talking about legal immigration, undocumented immigration, border security? Those are all different pieces of the puzzle.
So true. And it's really hard to get a clear picture if you don't know which piece you're looking at. It's easy to get swept up in the emotions of it all and miss the facts.
Absolutely. And that's why we're doing this deep dive, right? To give people the knowledge they need to understand the complexities and form their own opinions.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground today. Green cards, temporary visas, family reunification, employment-based preferences, the lottery, asylum. We even touched on NAFTA.
It's a lot to take in, but it's all connected.
It is, and I feel like I have a much better grasp on how it all works now, though I definitely have even more questions now too, but that's a good thing, right?
I think so. The more you learn, the more you realize there is to learn. It's a journey.
It is. And we're going to keep on exploring those questions when we come back after the break. We'll be diving even deeper into some specific examples and controversial issues within the world of U.S. legal immigration. Stay with us.
Looking forward to it. We were talking about how legal immigration, it often gets mixed up in those debates about border security and undocumented immigration.
Yeah, it's so important to remember those are separate issues. It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube by only looking at one side. You need to see the whole thing.
Exactly. It's about the bigger picture.
Okay, so we've got the big picture, but let's zoom in for a sec. You mentioned the H-1B visa earlier. Can you walk us through how that actually works and why it's always causing so much controversy?
Sure. So the H-1B, it's designed for what they call specialty occupations, right? Jobs that need very specific, specialized knowledge. Think software engineers, data scientists, architects, that kind of thing.
Okay, so high-level stuff.
Yeah, very high level. To even qualify, you usually need at least a bachelor's degree or something equivalent in the field. And your employer, they have to prove they couldn't find a qualified American to do the job.
So it's not like companies can just bring in whoever they want. There are rules.
Big time. And there's a limit on how many H-1Bs are granted every year, 85,000. And it's all done through a lottery system.
A lottery, seriously.
Seriously. So it's super competitive, and there's a lot of uncertainty involved. You might be totally qualified, but still not get picked.
Wow, that's wild. It's like a visa lottery within the visa system. But I've also heard people say that the H-1B is being used to replace American workers, bringing in people who will do the same job for less money. Is there any truth to that?
That's where a lot of the controversy comes from. There definitely have been cases where companies have been accused of, basically abusing the system, laying off American workers, then hiring H-1B holders to fill the same positions, but at lower wages.
That's not right.
It's definitely a point of contention, but it's a tricky issue. There are valid arguments on both sides.
So what is it about finding the right balance? Attracting skilled workers, but not undercutting American jobs in the process?
That's a big part of it. Some people argue that the H-1B is absolutely crucial for U.S. companies to stay competitive globally, to be able to attract top talent. They say we don't have enough highly skilled workers here in the U.S. to fill all these positions.
And then the other side says?
The other side argues that we need stricter rules to prevent exploitation, both of foreign workers and American workers, to make sure companies aren't just using the H-1B to drive down wages.
Man, it's easy to see why immigration is such a hot-button issue. It's not just about numbers and rules. It's about people's lives, their livelihoods.
Exactly. You've got economic concerns, ethical considerations. It's a lot to weigh.
It is. Okay, so the H-1B is definitely complex. We've also talked a bit about those H-2A and H-2B visas for agricultural and seasonal work. What are the big things to know about those?
Those are specifically about addressing labor shortages, in industries that have a hard time finding enough workers. like agriculture, hospitality, construction, that sort of thing. The H-2A, that one's strictly for agricultural work, and there's no cap on how many visas they give out.
No cap. So no lottery, no crazy competition for those spots, like with the H-1B.
Nope. But there are other requirements. Employers have to prove they couldn't find any American workers to do the jobs, and they have to guarantee certain housing and wage standards for the H-2A workers.
Okay, so there are safeguards in place to make sure workers aren't being exploited.
Exactly. It's not a free-for-all.
Makes sense. And what about the H-2B? How's that one different?
The H-2B is for those temporary, non-agricultural jobs, a lot of which are seasonal, landscaping, hotel work, jobs at ski resorts, things like that.
Yeah.
And unlike the H-2A, there is a cap on H-2B's $66,000 per year.
Back to the lottery system then.
Yep. Only so many spots to go around. It's interesting, isn't it, how even within temporary worker visas, there are so many different rules and structures.
It is. I guess it shows just how complex the whole system is. It's not just one thing. It's a million little things all working together, or sometimes against each other.
That's a good way to put it. It reflects how different industries have different needs and how the government is trying to balance those needs with, concerns about fair labor practices and the impact on American workers.
Right. It's all connected.
Yeah.
And we talked about the TN visa too, didn't we? The one that came out of NAFTA.
Yes. The TN visa, that one's super specific, just for professionals moving between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico.
So it's like a fast track for qualified people from those three countries.
You could say that. It covers a ton of different professions: accountants, engineers, scientists, teachers, you name it, as long as they have a job offer in the U.S. and meet the education and work experience requirements.
Okay, that makes sense. The part of a trade agreement, so it's all about encouraging economic cooperation. But what happens when trade agreements change? Do those visas just disappear?
That's a really good question. And it shows how closely immigration policy is tied to all these bigger political and economic forces. When NAFTA was renegotiated and replaced by the USMCA, there were definitely a lot of questions about what would happen to the TN visa.
So did it survive the trade deal makeover?
It did. They kept the TN visa in the USMCA, which just goes to show how important it still is in helping professionals move back and forth between the three countries.
Interesting. So even when things shift politically, there's still that understanding that, hey, we need these workers. It's not always about shutting the door completely. Sometimes it's about, building bridges.
I love that. It's about finding ways to manage the flow of people, not just stopping it altogether. There are benefits to having people move between countries for both sides.
For sure. I'm definitely starting to see how all these pieces fit together. I'm getting a much better sense of the details, but I'm also, starting to appreciate the human side of it all. It's not just visas and quotas. It's about families and careers and people seeking safety. It's about lives.
You're so right. It's easy to get lost in the numbers, but at the end of the day, immigration policies, they affect real people, their hopes, their dreams, their whole futures.
That's a powerful thought. Okay, so we've talked about a lot today. The big pathways, the specific visas, the controversies. I feel like I have a much better grasp on how this whole complex system works. But of course, now I have even more questions, which is a good sign, right?
Absolutely. It means you're thinking critically, engaging with the material. That's what we want.
Exactly. But before we totally overwhelm everyone with information, I'm curious, what are the key takeaways you want listeners to remember as they, go out into the world and try to make sense of this whole immigration thing?
I think the most important thing is to remember what we talked about earlier. Legal immigration. That's separate from border security and undocumented immigration. Those are different things, different challenges, different solutions.
Right. Don't let the rhetoric muddy the waters.
And the U.S. legal immigration system, it's built on this combination of family ties, employment needs, humanitarian concerns, and the goal of having a diverse population. It's not a perfect system, and there's always room for improvement, but understanding the core principles behind it, that's essential.
So it's not just about keeping people out. It's about balancing all these different priorities and finding ways to manage the flow of people that benefit the country as a whole. It's complicated.
It is complicated, but it's manageable. And lastly, I'd just say, remember that behind all the data, behind all the policies and debates, there are real people with real stories. Immigration affects lives. Don't forget that.
I won't. And I hope our listeners won't either. This deep dive has been fascinating and eye-opening. I've learned so much, but I'm also aware of how much more there is to learn.
That's the exciting part. The learning never ends. And the more we understand about complex issues like immigration, the better equipped we are to have these conversations and maybe even make a difference.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so we've explored the mechanics of the system. We've talked about the human impact. Now I want to shift gears a bit. Let's get personal for a minute. What surprised you during this deep dive? Did anything challenge your own ideas about legal immigration?
Honestly, it's amazing how much I didn't know. Like, the number of green cards given out every year, that really got me. 1 million people. I thought it'd be way lower with all the, political stuff about limiting immigration and all.
Yeah, that surprised me too. You really do get a different perspective when you dig into the actual numbers. For me, it was that wait time, 21 years. For a Mexican citizen trying to sponsor their kid, that was wow.
I know, right? Like, imagine waiting that long. It really hits you how those per-country caps, they're meant to make things fair, but they can also create these huge differences in how long people have to wait.
Exactly. Even when a policy has good intentions, there can be these unintended consequences that really affect people. It's so true. Well, we've definitely learned a lot about how the system works, all the different pieces, but we've also seen how much these policies affect people's lives, not just theory. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I'd say think about the future. Think about what U.S. legal immigration will look like down the road. We've seen how complex it is, all the different factors like the wait times, the caps, and how politics and the economy play a role. So how do we adapt? What needs to change? What can we do to make sure the system is ready for whatever the 21st century throws at us? It's not an easy question, that's for sure.
That's a great point to end on. It's not about having all the answers right now, but it's about asking the right questions and being part of the conversation. So to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and don't be afraid to think for yourselves. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into U.S. legal immigration. Until next time, keep diving.